So to close us out today, we asked David Zierden, the state climatologist, to please close out our symposium. So David Zierden earned his Bachelor's of Science degree in meteorology in 1996 at Florida State. He followed that with a Master's of Science in meteorology under the direction of Dr. James J. O'Brien, and then the then director of FSU's Center for Ocean and Atmospheric Prediction Studies. Following graduation, David served under Dr. O'Brien, a recognized world leader in ocean modeling and climate application studies, as the assistant state climatologist from 1998 through 2005. In 2006, Mr. Zierden was appointed state climatologist and served that role ever since. David is a full member of the American Association of State Climatologists and the American Meteorological Society and the Florida Climate Institute. He has published journal articles on satellite meteorology, climate variability, and wildfire threat, and the application of agriculture in the Southeast U.S., and has presented these findings at many professional conferences. He is well known among growers, producers, and the extension in the Southeast for providing seasonal climate forecasts, and presents this information at many workshops, trade shows, and commodity meetings. David Zierden is involved in many other climate application projects in Florida and the Southeast involving agriculture, water resources, environment, and human health. David Zierden grew up in Panama City, but has lived in Tallahassee since 1995. He is married to Pastor Bessie Olette Zierden?
Olette, yes.
Olette. And has two teenage children, Ian and Adam. Growing up in the outdoors and continuing to enjoy fishing, surfing, skiing, and running, helping spur his interest in weather and climate. Please welcome David Zierden.
All right, well, thank you very much, and thanks for the introduction, and for FSU Libraries and the organizing committee for such a great symposium today. So many good presentations. I feel a little shaken about having to wrap up with concluding marks, but I'll try to hold my end of the rope. I'm also going to go out of my comfort zone a little bit today. First, I love talking about the climate of Florida. Its unique facets, the variability, the risk we run here. But I'm not going to do that today. I'm going to talk about climate and climate change communication, which has been a recurring theme, especially during the morning sessions. Also, I didn't bring any PowerPoint slides. I have a story for that. The first time my wife ever saw me present was at a science cafe in a quirky little pub in Midtown called Waterworks. And we had an enthusiastic crowd, and she was there, and I'm not even 5 minutes into my presentation, and she's just buried in her phone doing Facebook. And afterwards she said, "All right, you know what you're talking about, great information, but there were just too many graphs and maps and complicated graphics that I couldn't understand them and I got lost." And she said, "Tell more stories and tell why it's applicable, how it's personal to your audience." And she was exactly right. So I'm going to try to do that today. Let me see. Before I go into climate communication, just kind of so we're all on the same ground, I'm going to give you a quick state of the climate rundown. Right now, carbon dioxide concentrations in our atmosphere are at 410 parts per million and continue to rise exponentially. By ice core studies in the Antarctic and Greenland, scientists estimate this is the highest level in the last million years or so, which encompasses half a dozen ice ages and interglacial periods. So as far as what we put into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuel, we're in uncharted territory. At the same time, globally average temperatures are up 0.9 of a degree Celsius over pre-industrial times. And that includes each of the last 4 years, globally averaged, have been the 4 warmest years in this record. So that's going on at the same time that we're increasing the greenhouse gas concentration. Global sea level risen 10 to 12 inches over pre-industrial times. And recent studies from satellite altimeter observations suggest that this rate may be starting to increase. Closer to home in the state of Florida, over the last 3.5 years, we've only had 2 months of below average temperatures. Every other month in Florida has been warmer than average. And as Danny Broyette showed this morning, a lot of that's happening in our overnight and nighttime temperatures, more so than in the daytime temperatures. Dr. Wing this morning gave a great rundown on how climate change is and can influence the intensity of hurricanes. Frequency is still more of an unknown, but it's a pretty solid relationship between a warming climate and how strong hurricanes can get. Dr. Elsner showed us that the same thing can be happening with tornadoes here in the United States. One last tidbit, in 2017, the U.S. recorded $306 billion of weather damages, by far, in a way, a record. So that's kind of where we're at. That's where we're at in the climate. Everything I said here has a high degree of certainty, both from our global observing systems and the very best peer-reviewed science. So none of that is really up for debate, is what I just gave you. So with that, let's switch gears to climate communication. Who are the best-known faces for climate change?
Al Gore.
Al Gore, Leonardo DiCaprio, even Bill Nye. Where are the climate scientists? I mean, at least astrophysics had Carl Sagan and Stephen Hawking, who knew the field. I'm not saying those others don't, but I think it points out the weakness of us as climate scientists to effectively communicate this to the public and to policymakers. So a little note about climate communication. Edward Maibach, he's the Director of Climate Change Communication at George Mason University. Actually, he was in University of Florida yesterday with Marshall Shepard and...
I went there.
It was awesome.
Oh yeah, and Marshall Shepard, John Morales, some of the real leaders in the field of climate communication. And I'm sorry I missed it. I think Tracy was there. But anyway, Edward Maibach a couple years ago came up with this kind of meme where he said he can get the main points of climate change across and certainly start the conversation with 5 simple talking points. And his 5 talking points were, it's real, it's us, scientists agree, it's bad, but there's hope. Now, I agree in spirit with these 5 talking points, but however, some of those are pretty substantial oversimplifications of the problem, and others use kind of emotionally charged language like it's bad and there's hope. My old high school coach always liked to say, hope is not a plan, and that certainly goes with climate change too. So, since I don't 100% agree with all those, I developed my own 5 talking points. These are to complement his, not to replace him. So I'm going to go ahead and give them to you. Number 1, science is not a belief system. I get ruffled when I get asked the question, well, do you believe in climate change, or do you believe climate change is happening? Or I don't even like it when a reporter will ask a politician if they believe in climate change. A better way to ask that is, what do you plan to do about climate change? But believe kind of implies accepting something on faith with a lack of evidence, which is certainly not the case with climate science. And science is a structured method of learning around the world and universe around us with careful observation and experimentation. Science is evidence-based. Science is not a bundled set of facts. Science is also incremental, with our knowledge base growing as one study builds upon the next. Sometimes it goes slowly, Sometimes there's even a step sideways or backwards before more steps are taken forward. But science is also, it's self-governing through the peer review process. So you trust the process, trust what it shows you, look at the building body of evidence, but believe really doesn't have anything to do with it. Number two is, I believe climate science is much broader than just global warming. I've spent decades working with agriculture in the tri-state areas, trying to better understand climate variability, the year-to-year changes in climate, seasonal forecasting, taking advantage of the El Nino-La Nina cycle. All of that's going to continue to go on even with the background climate changing. Another one, there are no new risks from climate change yet or in the foreseeable future. All the climate extremes, the storms, hurricanes, tornadoes, heat waves, droughts, floods, they've all occurred before. Now, don't get me wrong, climate change is and has a strong potential to change the nature of these extreme events, their frequency or their severity. But judging from the disasters last year and this year, and even in more distant past, we don't fully understand the climate system anyway, and we certainly are not resilient enough against these climate extremes and never have been. So climate change is going to worsen that, but there's a lot of basic science and a lot of basic good information in studying other aspects of the climate, which kind of goes hand in hand with my third point. Number three is, there's much in the science that is not settled. Yes, as far as the basics of climate change, it is settled. And even those that are labeled as skeptical scientists, I know some of them personally, they would all agree that, yes, the burning of fossil fuels has increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and that's the primary cause for the warming trend we see. But there's much more nuances in climate science that are still yet to be learned. As an example, there's a simple measure called climate equilibrium sensitivity. And basically it's how much will the Earth's temperature rise with a doubling of carbon dioxide. Well, even in the last IPCC report in 2015, they gave a broad range of 1.5 to 4.5 degrees Celsius for that climate sensitivity. That's a very broad range and a lot of uncertainty there. Some other unknowns. We know a good bit about climate variability and year-to-year changes, and have some skill in some seasons at forecasting seasonal climate out 6 months or so. However, we have basically no skill in the 2 to 15 year time range. Big area of unknown. And as we saw this morning, climate models struggle to accurately reproduce extreme events like hurricanes or floods, so gleaning information on how these might change in the future is very difficult. In short, there's much uncertainty with the exact trajectory our climate is going to take and what those impacts are going to be. So I would hardly call the science settled. Number 4 is there will be losers, but there will be some winners. Part of being resilient is going to be anticipating and taking advantage of favorable aspects of our changing climate. For example, grain production in the higher latitudes, the Corn Belt up into Canada, in Siberia, may be able to increase with the warming atmosphere. I don't know that a lot of research has been done, but could a warming state of Florida allow for the citrus industry to move back into North Florida, South Georgia, even South Carolina, where it might be less vulnerable to citrus greening that's devastating the industry? I don't know if that work's been done, but it's a good question. All right, my final point, again, this might be a little controversial, but it's not your fault. I mean, the increasing use of coal in the mid-1800s, the successful drilling for oil later in that century, it enabled the Industrial Revolution. With a readily available and affordable source of energy, human civilization made unprecedented advances in industry, technology, economy, health, longevity. Standards of living in almost every country rose tremendously with the advent of the Industrial Revolution. The global civilization, we arrived at this point over the centuries and largely all together. So climate change is not because you drive a big SUV or we're fortunate enough to be born in the United States where we do have the highest per capita CO2 footprint in the world. But now don't get me wrong. I don't like using guilt as a motivating factor for action on climate. I am in no way saying that it absolves us of our responsibility to act now and be responsible for the planet going forward. Two different things. I disagree with using guilt. So, I also disagree with doomsday messaging. Yes, it's a critical crisis that's going to affect our civilization going forward, without a doubt. But when the message gets too much as doomsday, like it could be the end of civilization, I've seen in some headlines, I think that's counterproductive. So a few wrap-up points that I want to talk about, and I want to talk about the most recent IPCC special report that came out a month or so ago on reaching the targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Kind of the main conclusions from this report is we need to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius to avoid some of the worst impacts. And even if we limit it to 2 degrees Celsius, those impacts will still be more dire. The other one is, in order to reach that 1.5 degree goal, we need to cut our carbon emissions by 45% in 12 years and by 100% by 2050. The Paris Accord they had these same targets, and it was a great step forward for the nations of the world to come together. I'm disappointed that we pulled out, but still, the pledges the countries put forth in the Paris Accord don't begin to reach those goals. And another problem is to reach that kind of goal, cut our carbon and fossil fuel use in half, basically in 12 years, and altogether by 2050, would require a monumental re-engineering and transformation of the global energy, industry, transportation, and agricultural systems, and as we learned this morning, also the economic and governance systems in order to affect that kind of change. The kind of change society has not ever seen before, even with the Industrial Revolution. So it's a monumental task if we wanted to reach those goals. So those were my words of despair. Now I'm going to bring some words of hope. Seeing how difficult those goals are to reach, adaptation and improved resilience has to be a priority, along with mitigating the emissions of CO2. And we have to, as a society, continue to develop renewables and hasten that transformation to renewable forms of energy as quickly and as broadly as we can. Every little bit we can limit our emissions can only help reduce the problem in the future and generations to come. And some other things. What else can we do? I'm often asked, as an individual, what can we do? Very topical. Number 1, 2, and 3 on my list is vote. to my knowledge, there's not been an important political race either in Florida or nationally where climate has been a deciding factor. Poll after poll on voter concerns that come out every year, climate is usually down by the bottom of the list. So until the voters are serious about this issue, the politicians are not going to be. If the voters show it's a primary area of concern, they'll jump on board pretty quick. There's always other things you can do. Efficiency in your electric use at home and at work, and especially in transportation. A more fuel efficient or even electric vehicle, public transportation or biking when you can. That'll make some huge impacts. Diet is one. Eat less meat, particularly red meat. The carbon footprint for meat products is almost 10 times that of vegetarian options. I'm not saying we all need to be vegans, but that's one thing that you can do. And cutting down on red meat in particular has its own health benefits. Personal alternative energy. When I visit Israel or even Greece, there's a solar water heater on top of every house, on top of every building. There's solar panels in every vacant field. Especially Greece had a very aggressive subsidy plan to help people put these in. Unfortunately, in Florida, we don't even have net metering, which would require utility companies to buy back your excess energy and put it on the grid. And until we get net metering, the wide installation of home solar panels is not economically viable. They have to be replaced every 10 years, and the numbers just really don't add up. If you can afford to put them on your own, knowing that it might cost you a little extra, that's great. Utility companies are getting on board. We have the big solar field over by the airport where you can opt on your utility bill to have a percentage of your bill from solar that cost a little more. There's a huge solar field going in off I-10 over near the Swanee River. It's been really interesting to watch that go up. So, and one other thing is, even in the face of stalled policy changes at the national level, the amount of change that could be made at the state and local level is still significant. As we see with the South Florida Climate Compact, all the initiatives California has taken, states in the Northeast are following suit. So there's still a lot that can be done on the state and local level. So I think that's all I have for today, and I appreciate you letting me get on my soapbox this late in the afternoon.
That is all we have today. Thank you so much for attending the symposium. This is the first time we've done it in Iraq, and so we are so happy to